So we're looking at John chapter 5 as we go through John's Gospel. And the first question is, how long is a piece of string? Or perhaps, what happens when an immovable object meets an irresistible force? Or why is it that when you made a nice round of toast and it falls to the floor, it always falls butter side down? Well, those are some of the big mysteries of life, aren't they? Mysteries, quandaries, enigmas. And the first two questions that I've just quoted there are often used to convey the unknown, the mysterious, the incomprehensible questions of life, ones that we just cannot seem to get our head around. And looking at John chapter 5, there's loads in there, but particularly focusing on the healing at the Pool of Bethesda. On reading this chapter, one striking question hits me. And I am really sorry, but it's one of the questions which means I haven't got a full answer to. In Jerusalem, there was a pool where the sick and the disabled sat and were brought. And they would probably beg and they would seek the help and the kindness of strangers. And it could be actually a really good and regular source of income. But while they were there, they also had the hope of healing. Associated with this pool called Bethesda or Bethsaida was an idea that when the waters bubbled of their own accord, when they were stirred, then the first person into the water could be healed. And I suppose when you think about it, it's quite a barbaric and cruel way of healing. It's almost like healing meets the Hunger Games. It's quite awful, really, when you think about it. But the place you can still see in Jerusalem today. Archaeologists have uncovered this colonnaded area, and there's been some evidence also that it wasn't only just a Jewish pool for healing, but pagans used it as well. Not far from this area there was an altar to the Greek god Asclepius, who was the god of healing, and it's found nearby. And there's similarities between this pool and, if you've ever been to Bath, and the healing waters of Bath, in a sense that here was a place that you could go and the waters would provide healing. How often these stirrings of the waters actually happened, who knows? How many healings happened, again, who knows? But to this situation, Jesus comes along during one of his visits to Jerusalem, and he sees what John describes as just a large number of people who are sick, who are disabled, who are blind, and they're lying there and they're waiting and they're begging and they're hoping. And amongst this crowd, he goes to one man, one who has been crippled for 38 years. And Jesus goes to him and he asks him, "Do you want to get well?" Now, this seems like a ridiculous question with an equally ridiculously obvious answer. Of course he'd want to get well, wouldn't he? Well, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, because he'd been in this condition for 38 years. In those days, with these conditions, begging and charity and the kindness of strangers was essentially your occupation. It defined everything about you. In a sense, the man had become his condition. A healing by the waters or any other means would have actually meant a complete and utter change to his life. It might have been more scary, the prospect of a new life of healing, than it would be the daily grind of what he was doing. It seems like after so many years as being a paralyzed beggar, could he actually be anything else? And to Jesus' question, his response is an interesting one. So Jesus asks, "Do you want to get well?" And the man's answer is not an immediate, "Yes, of course I do," but more, "Actually, there's no one around to help me, so I'm kind of stuck here." And it reminds me that so many times we can get stuck in our conditions from the past, both physically but also spiritually, maybe even mentally. We can get caught in a rut, and in theory we want to get well, but we get so identified with the condition and our way of being, our way of thinking, our way of identifying ourselves, that actually it's very hard to really fully embrace the offer of being healed. People can get stuck in their conditions. But to this man, Jesus says, even to his response, Jesus said to him, "Get up." And what's really interesting is this word that Jesus used, "get up." is actually one that's really closely associated to the whole idea of resurrection, and one which creeps up later on in this passage, this idea of rising up at the end of days, getting up. And to this command, the man simply obeys. He gets up, he picks up his mat, and he goes. He's healed immediately. And this is where my query, my enigma, and the mystery lies for me. Why only one? At this place, which is well known for people who are ill, who are sick, the pavements and the steps of this area are covered with people who are ill, whose lives have been destroyed by illness. They're disrupted, they're blind, and they're all seemingly desperate for a healing, and they're hanging around the site waiting for the miraculous bubbling of the waters. And yet Jesus only heals one man at this place. Maybe it's because he was the one who'd been there longest, or been in that condition for so long, and that indeed there was no one there to help him. Maybe, but the fact remains, in this story and in our practices, our experiences, sometimes people are healed, but many, majority indeed, are not. And the enigma is not that Jesus can heal, but that some are healed and some are not. And the puzzling over this has filled many pages of books, fueled hours of discussion, and been the source of many people's heartache, doubt, and confusion. And there's no way I'm going to be able to answer that fully. I don't understand why Jesus just healed that one man. But I think there's more going on to this healing than just Jesus flexing his spiritual muscles. Looking at the rest of the chapter might help us understand what's going on. It may not answer that question fully, but I might understand something about Jesus and his healings in general. What are they about anyway? So the man is healed, and immediately he gets into trouble with the authorities for carrying his mat. And this is where we spend most of the time in this chapter. This is where it springboards from. Something he does goes against the law, and the law of keeping the Sabbath, because it was the Sabbath day. And the truth is, he actually didn't go against the law, the Torah, the written code. He went against the rules and regulations that had been built up by the teachers of the law to ensure the non-breaking of the laws of the Sabbath. They were so desperate not to break the Sabbath, they made loads of rules that people had to follow. And when they found out that who was behind all this, notice this guy doesn't even know it was Jesus initially. He said, and they say, what happened? They said, this person. So he experienced Jesus without understanding who he was. It's an interesting one. But when they find out that it was Jesus who was behind it all, things start getting dangerous for Jesus. The Sabbath was a defining practice of the people of Israel, and Jesus, this seeming upstart from the north, was rubbishing it. This was dangerous. It leads to Jesus responding to the Jewish leaders with some pretty crazy claims. He singles out God as his father, that he's a special relationship. In a sense, he's like his apprentice son, continuing his father's work even on the Sabbath. And all of this brings accusations of blasphemy against Jesus. His outrageous claims extend to doing great works, having a special relationship with Father, being able to give life, having the authority to judge. He even goes on to talk about the final resurrection when God's kingdom is fully fulfilled. But notice how many times in this passage, in this conversation with the leaders, does Jesus talk about life and the giving of life. You see, the Sabbath was not just about restrictions of activities. The original idea was that it was a day of rest, but it was actually more a day of restoration, a day of re-creation, of restoring to what was the original. And this is actually at the heart of Jesus' message. It's what we've already seen so far in this book. To the situation that Jesus finds himself in, he brings new wine. He brings new birth. He brings the offer of new birth. He brings the offer of new water, of a new healing, a new way of life. All of this is about the new creation that Jesus is bringing in. That is what is at the heart of Sabbath. The Jews were eagerly waiting a new day when all things would be made right. And Jesus is showing in his actions, in his teachings, that this new day has dawned in him, but just like it refers back in chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, he came to those who should have recognized him, but they didn't accept him. Jesus wasn't the kind of a wandering healing machine. He wasn't a ministry showman. The healings and the miracles, and even more importantly, when he did these miracles and to whom, so often on the Sabbath and to the least and the lowly, were at the heart of his message. He was demonstrating and inaugurating a new day which would be fully launched with his own resurrection. So when Jesus asks this man, "Do you want to get well?" his answer could have been, indeed kind of was, "No, I'm happy waiting for others to help me into the pool. That'll do me." But when Jesus calls him to get up, and he does, his standing up, his walking into a new way of life is an image of the new creation, the new world that Jesus is bringing in. And they, of course, are all very confused about this. And they demand to know what his evidence is to this authority. And with that, Jesus just draws out four things. First of all, he doesn't back up his own claims. He doesn't come in his own name. He doesn't come with his own authority. He's there in his Father's name. He's there in the name of God, of Yahweh, his own Father. And people need to make up their own mind about him. The second thing is he refers to John the Baptist. John the Baptist was considered a prophet, their own living prophet who was there live amongst them. And his teachings were popular with the people, but he actually directed people's gaze to Jesus. And that's where people drew the line. His teaching was good, but I don't know about this person, Jesus. And then Jesus refers to the works that the Father has given him to do, the miracles, the signs that John refers to. At this stage, Jesus would have done many, many signs. Like in John 21, it says, Jesus did many signs, we haven't got space for them. These works were evidence of who Jesus was and what his mission was about. And then finally in verse 39, he talks about Scripture. The people were building their lives, their whole faith, on poring over the letters of the law, whilst missing entirely what the Scriptures were actually about. They were about pointing to Jesus. And the equivalent for us is that phrase that we've used before. It's not about knowing about Jesus, but it's about knowing who Jesus is. Noticing that this man who was healed didn't know a great deal about Jesus at all, didn't even know his name initially. But what he did have was an experience of Jesus, an experience of new life. So when it comes to this tough question, which is why this one man and why not all the others, I don't know the mystery. I don't know the answer to the mystery. I don't know the answer to why some people are healed and some people are not. What we are told, what we're shown here, is that all of these are tastes of the kingdom of heaven breaking through, are foretastes of the new creation that Jesus brings, when the old will be gone and the new will come in Jesus.